There's no denying the large-scale impact of the stories told in the AAA space. But when it comes to pushing the envelope and speaking truth to power, that's indies. Our next speakers, using the platform of their newly released visual novel, Solace State, use the game's unique environment and visuals to deliver messages about queerness and political revolution. From the indie studio Vivid Foundry, please welcome Tanya Kan and Seamus Ly.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Game Devs of Color chat. I'm so excited to be here today. Today, we're talking about the design and narrative decisions in creating a cohesive game world in Solace State. Solace State asks, can you retain your humanity while fighting against a corporate biotech conspiracy? Play as the young hacker Chloe, who confronts political plots as she fights for her friends and her neighbors. Your choices in building up relationships and communities can revolutionize into radical change, hope, heartbreak, and more. So you're joining us today at Queer Advocacy in Indie Game Design, a Solace State retrospective. We'll be chatting about how our visual novel's narrative design, writing, and unique camera presentation with 2D characters set to 3D environments brings queer and marginalized advocacy to the forefront of this game. I'll pass it to you, Seamus, to do your introduction.
Yeah, so I'm Seamus. My pronouns are he, him. I've worked on a handful of indie titles in recent years, mostly as a programmer and or technical narrative designer. I do a little bit of everything, primarily as a Unity generalist on past projects, as well as on Solid State. And concerning Solid State itself, I've worked on a lot of the level design, which includes placing of characters, diegetic text, which is the text you'll see just like in the world space, camera work in the scenes, technical art, some 2D here and there. But mostly I've worked on programming, design tools, and a lot of bug fixes in recent months in sort of the final stretch before our release. And outside of work, I like Ace Attorney, Vocaloid, I play Dungeons & Dragons, and I write gay little stories that sometimes threaten to become games.
Nice. I'm Tanya Kan. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the director and executive producer of Solace State. I started Solace State almost 8 years ago off the back of another self-directed prototype. Oh my God. I was compelled to do a game about finding a place of belonging in a socially stratified city with many arbitrary guards and checkpoints. My work on Solace State includes everything from narrative writing as the lead writer, game design, level design, 2D and 3D art, funding, running events, direction, speaking, admin, PR, marketing, and social media. Outside of work, I enjoy playing rhythm games badly. I adore dance, reading, writing, and illustrating spicy OCs when I have the time. I don't remember the last time I've read or created something that's not queer, to be honest. All right, with that, without any further ado, let's jump into the trailer. It's so exciting. This is our launch trailer. It's the first time we're showing it, kind of, except you're in the future, so not the first time. Let's do it.
We've scrapped in the flesh for these streets. Now they crave only moneyed minds. Skyscrapers polished to a shine, fawning looks and voice against these shock troop lines. We must break free.
All right, so to sort of introduce this section, Solid State over the years grew to eventually include 31 fully illustrated recurring characters and many more background characters. 3 of the main characters are dateable. One playthrough is around 7 to 8 hours long, depending on how fast you could read. And the full game, if you want to complete all the branches, would take around 14 hours to play. And from what I understand, actually, the game used to be smaller. Like there were changes throughout the story where a minor character suddenly became a major character, and then all of a sudden, there were all these new depths that the team wanted to explore, and like all these new little things to pick at.
Yeah, for sure. Solace State did start off so differently. It was a very homebrewed game that would take less than an hour to play and was a vignette of someone who was struggling with the desire to fight for their rights in an extremely stratified and isolated cyberpunk society. This earlier walking sim game with live action footage actually didn't give me the depth that I was wanting to explore, as you said, with character motivation. So it gradually morphed into a visual novel because the main driving force of the game is to really look at choices and how it helps or hinders building social trust in society. You have constant questions about how society and its people can care for one another or can be neglectful through systems outside of their control. These are deep moral quandaries, and I couldn't help but noodle over them. This is also how we paced out our interactive choices. So we really want players to feel like they are really getting to know their characters and motivations, as well as their city and the underlying socio-political structures that gave rise to their hopes, their fears, and their behaviors. You're so right. There has been new characters that pop up, like Swaley, who I will talk about a little later on. We'll come back to her and other characters later. First, let's talk about how we structure the choices in this game under the hood.
Okay, sort of behind the scenes on the more technical side, the game features in its entirety over 100 variables. Each one used to change the outcome of encounters, as small as an everyday conversation with Chloe's friends and as big as society's willingness to stand together. And we used Unity and Articy to make this happen. On the slide here, actually, you could see how complicated some of the some of the dialogue structures could get. As well as like how a typical hack might be structured in Articy. So we track this, society's willingness to stand together. It's tracked by what we called internally the social cohesion score. And the other big one was relationship score to determine Chloe's closeness to her love interest. And they don't always come up in places you may expect. There's like no player-facing way to track your progress, but it may be that, choices you don't think matter too much to the overall movement in the moment may end up mattering more than expected. And with this, the dialogue, the moment-to-moment story, its outcomes feel responsive, situational. Something Chloe says to a fellow protester may come back up in conversation 4 chapters down the line, or maybe even all the way at the end of the game and affect both Chloe's and even that person's ending or possibly endings. Though speaking of endings, there are 8 total sections in the epilogue, so 38 different ending nodes and all. Big wrap up of all these events that are given closure, or maybe an idea at least of what may happen next to these characters, and all depends on your choices and these many variables. So as I said, responsive and situational. Looking back, it was a bit of a beast in and of itself, working with so many different outcomes. Obviously, the more variation you introduce to a script, the more testing needs to be done. And it was something that came up when we were testing for specific routes, achievements associated with decisions that made, that you would be making across multiple acts. And in, Act 1, Scene 4 alone, there's something like 4 or 5 different ways the encounter with Finn at the community center could play out. And the way you treated him there could impact situations that arise, 6 hours down the line, positively or negatively, depending on what Chloe does there. But it makes a small but noticeable difference, in the overall movement against next year. And actually, we went back and added more variables at some point, I think. As scripts were getting revised, more dialogue was included to sort of bring stuff that didn't feel all that wrapped up yet to a close. There were some issues, admittedly, with the additions we were making, but I think that, at the end of the day, it was still a net positive to, go back and make sure that the writing was sort of extra tight, especially for a game of this size, that leans so much into the story. And then on the note of achievements, we ended up having 38 achievements, I think. The same for PC and Xbox. That was sort of a team effort. I did some of the achievement art for the icons. Our technical narrative designer, Sunny, composited them and turned them into wallpapers for Xbox. And then Tanya and Sunny both did the writing for them.
Yeah, that's really cool. I just even looking over the sprawl of the text, we created basically enough to fill 4 novels and more. That's exactly how long this game is. And we still have so much potential additional content. We'd love to do a DLC actually.
Yeah.
On to the next topic, which is relates back to what is the modus behind all of this? What was the modus operandi behind all of this? And I will go to the next slide. Let's go here. Yes, it's about researching activism. And basically, my question was, what is worth fighting for? What can propel us to make some of the most important choices in our lives? This is what I kept asking myself first when I was in school for political science and cinema studies, and also now as the foundation of this game consistently. In hindsight, like, I'm really glad that that's really been thorough. That's what we've kept the whole entire time. And a lot of it to me has to do with redressing unequal power dynamics, as well as a mishmash of socio-political structures that require our collaboration or complicity in order to sustain itself. So, a lot of progressive activism has grown out of a neglected need for a better future and an outcry against dehumanizing politics. It's something that many of us in marginalized communities live with day after day, and it's where that sense of injustice can stem from. And in Solace State, like many games, there's unequal power dynamics at work where the protagonists do not have access to a sheer amount of power in capital, violence, and legitimacy that Nexier, the major conglomerates in the game, has. By the way, Nexier stands for New Extensions in Reality. So you know kind of where their mind's at in terms of hubris. They have their hands in building roads, security personnel, and now biotech.
Yeah, so I guess on that note, maybe we could speak to what do the protagonists have then at their disposal to sort of fight for their livelihoods and for their rights?
For sure. They use creative ways to connect with one another that encourages an exchange of ideas and energy from different perspectives. They use public forums to inform themselves and share knowledge. A key part of this is in the scenes where Chloe has to build rapport with the local community. We've seen this in Occupy Central movements in real life in North America in creating tents of knowledge. There's a scene in which the protesters really get organized and provide for the communities in temporary hubs. This is also actually inspired by the documentary Winter on Fire, which covers Ukraine's fight for freedom, as directed by Yevgeny Evanesky.
Yeah, and as I recall, there's a few different scenes where Chloe's going around and trying to gather her allies basically and sort of see where the community is at in terms of what they want for the movement. And opinions vary drastically. Like there's people like Waylon, who is Torrent's older brother, and Sassathorn, who is a friend of Waylon's, who are a little more willing to sort of get their hands dirty, so to speak. Their introductions are right to the point about what they believe will bring about change. But there's also characters who are a bit indifferent at first and maybe need a bit of a push, to get their priorities in order. What Nexier is doing is bad for everyone, and you can't really afford to not take a side or give into despair before the fight's even started. You see a lot of that come together in Act 2, Scene 3, where Chloe's like trying to get people to come out to a debate about, the current conversation about Nexier. Depending on the choices that the player can make there, she gets some surprisingly rigid people to come around.
Yeah, Ashley and I were in the writing room together. She's my co-writer, Ashley Cooper, and we were really thinking about how can we talk about this in a way that is relatable to people who might not necessarily have been in a protest situation before, but have seen resistance against talking about anything political in their lives. So there are kind of those conversations that we've had, and like some of these people can be older or they can be very young too. There's not like a specific age associated with that. But on the other hand, everyone has their own histories, and we really want to emphasize that history refused to be silenced, and thus people who really try to emphasize that and their culture really does have a superpower and the structures in which they perceive that inequality. So for example, a character named Sonam talks about the Civil War period in which Chloe has never experienced directly, and she has to confront this history in order to really fully understand where that person comes from, even though she's never been in a wartime situation. Chloe in particular does have her icono-hacking as well, which is something we termed for this game, which is hacking without interfaces, but doing through this quantum state manipulation, which she discovered. In a way, this is a shorthand for trying to blend in. It's a bit of a science fiction fantasy element blending in a world that's not built for you, while trying to read the social scripts of trying to avoid trauma. And after a while, there is this very queer question of why blend in when you can do something to change the world for the better and for more people to be authentically themselves? What is the new scripts that can be involved? Again, it is a bit fantastical, but it asks some really crucial questions about our humanity and our choices if and when we are given power, and also when basic rights are taken away from us. So there's many ways of looking at power dynamics, as you can tell on the books on the right, which really inspired me. Completely out of order here, Sarah Ahmad's Cultural Politics of Emotion emphasizes how governance and politics are shaped by emotions of things like disgust and hatred, but also conversely, the misuse of language of love informing in-groups and out-groups in the calls for hypernationalism, xenophobia, misogyny, and bigotry. It's not really all just rational actors making rational choices here. There's also a very strong thorough line of emotions involved in creating even at the national level. Adrienne Mary Brown's book talks about how much listening and poetry matters in cultivating anti-oppressive spaces and in activating community and truly thriving on creating positive change. And I absolutely love this book. It's not like just a straightforward guide on how to strategize against a world that may not be built to include you. And her emphasis on listening is just so key to this. And I absolutely adore and recommend this book at every point that I have. And that's some of the elements in which we put into Solace State as well. It's a lot of listening to others, it's a lot of finding empathy. Now, Dr. Ronald Daybert's Black Code talks about nation states and conglomerates jockeying for power against each other in digital surveillances, an incredible book. And we play around with surveillance, which I'll talk about a little later on in the camera works that we have in this game. Meanwhile, Popovic's Blueprints for Revolution talks about the importance of nonviolent protests with a focus on the turn-of-century movements and how it brings even grannies to come out to support mass movement, which is really a technique to galvanize communities, which is really exciting. Okay. I've rambled on about books a lot.
So on the discovery of friendships and community building, there's a sort of hopeful vibe about like the whole thing when you have marginalized members of society working together, but also facing this like escalating threat of violence, which you could probably see from the trailer.
Absolutely. So a lot of the world building is buttressed by interviewing frontline activists and politicians in East Asia, as well as tying this to my North American-centric research on comparative political governance and democracies, and also when allowances are made for horizontal governance, which has kind of been my focus. And I'm really delighted to hear when people respond well to this, because they're like, oh yeah, this is how protest movements feel like. I feel like I'm being included with progressive movements. So I'm glad that we were able to really bring that to the fore. My research effectively helped me frame the type of activism that are paced in the story as well. Not to give too much away, but working with activists, before working with activists, I would have wrapped up the game after one expression of a successful protest. Now in this version of this massive game, which is like around 14 hours long if you play through everything, you get really multiple avenues of direct action, which is fantastic. What I found is that friends and communities and working through societal-wide trauma together in many of these cases of building momentum for a movement is really finding their niche and also finding their people. Folks will stand together sometimes, even if their politics are not exactly the same and they don't fly under the same banner because of the multiplicity of political action. And they share an empathy with one another to want to see a reduction of harm and inherited trauma. Another aspect of the connections is that ensuring lines of communication are open to generate awareness for the every person as well as to the press. And that's really important in terms of, especially for progressive movements, because activists do want their stories told as broadly as possible and also as humanizing as possible. There's a lot of trust involved here because there's actually not that much room to not trust. And that's one thing that you'll see happen over and over again across movements around the world. And then we're just going to jump now to visual storytelling.
So I could take over for this. So there's a lot you can do with the 3D spaces that we have in the game. We have like these sort of areas, neighborhoods, we call them, and like there's a lot you could do in terms of like framing conversations, and also working in tandem with the diegetic text, and as well as with like the camera, because the camera system that we have is quite unique. In the way that it cuts through structures and works to create these sort of really interesting establishing shots that transition either straight to or from the action. There are times where, we'll start with an establishing shot of a building exterior and then slowly pan down to an interior view to give you an idea of what building we're in, which you might come to recognize over the course of the game because you do revisit quite a few areas. And then, it'll sweep over towards the characters to settle you into the scene's current location. Just give us a break from the movement here. But in terms of the visual storytelling, some of it can be emphasized by the way the camera is angled for a particular story beat. For example, we may have something like a desperate situation, and so the camera may be tipped in one direction to convey an uncomfortable feeling, or like in scenes that need to be more fast-paced or convey a sense of urgency, the camera may move or, almost snap between its waypoints. And then in intimate scenes, you might see the camera pulled closely towards a character or characters, either hiding some of their features or maybe highlighting their expressions or unique poses in the moment. And these expressions, just as an example on the side there, were something that Sunny took ownership of. But there'd be times where, I communicate with her what I thought would work best in a particular still, or she'd suggest something and I'd be like, yes, that works perfectly with what I was trying to portray, and maybe like move some of the characters around the level design itself. And we also had a number of visual effects that we could scatter throughout a scene, some of which are more subtle than others. I made a few VFX tools that would let us smoothly, change the color grading and visuals of each neighborhood, for example, portray intense moments during hacking, maybe winding down from those moments, and a few smaller animated visuals that would work to signal particular emotions to the player, Chloe's emotions, that is. And something I tried to keep in mind as I was working on the level design earlier on, was this like importance of having shots that would attempt to mimic or achieve like a tableau like look, because there'd be long stretches where you're on one shot, and I wanted to be sure that the scenes were either established nicely to give you something to think about, or that they look interesting in one way or another throughout the time you spend looking at it. And overall, I think I'm happier with some scenes over others, but I think that what I created ended up perfectly serviceable for what we were trying to achieve. I'd say that one of the most important parts for my level design personally was just to keep, make sure that everything that needed to be visible was still easily readable, like the diegetic text. And when working with some of the spaces, mostly enclosed spaces with not a whole lot of text real estate, it was kind of difficult, but it meant having to get creative with where we placed everything. I think next time it'd be a good idea to try and design the environments around limitations of the camera system, possibly with storyboards, like making sure there's enough space to cut into the walls with the camera, without also reducing how much space there is to work with. But everything still turned out really nice. And I can't talk about some of the scenes I want to talk about at the risk of spoilers, but I'm hoping that what I've said about the visual design, comes through clearly enough on a playthrough. And I look forward to seeing how people react to one scene in particular that I worked on that is fast-paced and quite different from what you might have gotten used to at that point in the game. And it was actually featured on one of the slides as a little teaser, so look forward to that.
There are so many scenes in this game that you level design really well. And I was just like, oh, we really worked closely together on this. It's really cool because we started with the 3D art. There's one in particular where it was just like a narrow hallway, and it's just like, oh, it's smashing. But we have to really jump to the next slide here. When I first designed this in early 2015, and I kept prototyping the camera work, 2015, what is that? And then in 2017 onwards, scenes 1.4 and 1.2 were one of the first ones to undergo a lot of those iterations. That would be essentially one of the first hacks would be Finn's hack that you see in some of the demos if you played it. For example, what am I doing with the Divergent camera? Well, I was really trying to find a way to visually represent a diversity of different experiences in a hyper-modern, hyper-capitalistic space, but one that has uneven progress. In the early days of the internet, there's this idealized wish for democracy through this tool of well, the internet. And then there's this desire for equity that was not clearly realized. And that digital failure is matched by a political and economic one. Instead, we have this threat of protectionism, of surveillance in equal measure, just as we have the threats and promise of so much digital news, which unfortunately there's an obfuscation of what's real and what's fake. So the camera work is really supposed to look uncanny. It is a metaphor for hypermodern confrontation of constantly being in and out of a space that's supposed to be rooted but feels anything but. There's also the kind of slippery feel of the camera with its presence in time and space that doesn't really mimic anything else in film. And this is really my playful response to Benjamin's aura theory, if you will, and Ferrilia's hypermodern camera cuts. I got you, cinema studies people. The camera never really mimic an analog film camera, but instead they're free roaming and asymmetrical, framing a queer perspective rather than that of a wow, I can't even speak that. Cis-het male gaze. So in some ways, the game's response is to Laura Mulvey's work on feminist filmmaking. And here's a really quick slide of that. Okay, on to the next topic.
Right. So the story explores different forms of love, from platonic to romantic, to and of memory and family, and how pivotal love is in building hopeful societies. An example of familial love and how it's explored in the game. If you've seen demo footage or maybe played the demos yourself, you're probably familiar with Waylon, who again is Torrent's older brother, and the two are close. They have a bit of a complex relationship with their father, who Chloe does have the opportunity to eventually meet. And her interactions with both Waylon and Torrent's father, and her treatment of both can pave very different paths for Torrent's story. Torrent is someone who cares deeply for everyone in his life, even if they might not get along at first. And his opinion may be swayed one way or the other, depending on player choices. But he still is his own person whose love for his family and his friends and potentially partner make his relationships and how he maintains them a bit more complicated. And I guess on the note of potential partners, Chloe can opt to remain friends with all of her potential love interests and pursue platonic relationships with them instead. In times of strife, it's this beautiful little light in the dark to find people you can confide in and can trust to keep your best interest in mind. And that concept of, solidarity and love and care needn't be tied solely to finding romance. Finding community in developing these support systems with those who are not part of your family is something that is very much part of the queer experience. For me personally, and maybe an experience that others can attest to based on just what I've seen online, I find that LGBTQ plus people are really good at finding each other, and sometimes they may not even realize it. It just so happens that you find each other and you get along with other queer people, and you can't really describe it until one day it sets in and you're like, that makes a lot of sense. And as I was brushing up on Solace State's narrative for the first time, when I first joined the project, reading the scripts and stuff, every time a new character came up and I'd look at the art for them, I'd be like, yeah, they're a little fruity. It was really cathartic and I think important to be able to do that. It's important to have these stories where you have queer people who could just be, because amidst these tense times and everything else going on, you have these little moments where these characters, queer visibly or not, can just be themselves, and you see it. Torrent in particular was a character I connected with for more reasons than one, and I'm hopeful that players will be able to look at some of these characters, even the minor ones, and see themselves reflected. All of that is before we even get into how important it is to show, yes, the front runners of the revolution are queer. They're people of color, women of color mostly, and they're going to change the world. Every relationship matters, in terms of player character with Chloe. And it was important that I think that we made that clear. There's endings where Chloe ends up with no significant other, and they're just as conclusive as ones where she does. It's not half finished or anything. She still grows as a person without the need for that sort of connection, and the overall message, though slightly different, is still one that speaks to hope and looking forwards, and unity. And basically by the end, you can look back on all these connections that you've made throughout the game, or maybe didn't make, and you see this wonderful sort of network that you've built and can be proud of, or maybe what could have been if you made different decisions.
Oh, I love that. Love that you said that. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Characters don't really get siloed off from each other. So, in terms of the design of the game, we don't have branches or roots that never converge back into the main through line of the movement story just because you want to romance a character. And I have to say, like, a quote from Bell Hooks here really helped inform both myself as a person as well as for the development of this game, which is queer is not about who you're having sex with, although that can be a dimension of it, but queer is about having this, about being the self that is at odds with everything around it. And that has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. And I love that. Um, so yeah, no matter where in the world, activists also need downtimes, and this is where they can be more reflexive about what they need, who they are, and who they want to be. This is different from different forms of love. This is also where different forms of love and care can flourish. Activism as a relay marathon is of many people rather than a sprint of a singular hero. We designed this to reflect real life movements that don't centralize around figureheads, even if there are recognizable names. For activists, things can change at any time, including the will to push forward. And we try to emulate that as well. Of course, this is reflexive of how motivations and our reflections on traumas, hot issues, and even past successes can change. People can share moments of how they have come to have agency, and this really validates each other's experiences. So there's really the strong need to share. And in Solace State, you see this principally in Swaley, who we created as a full-fledged main character. And in the past, she's a little bit more on the sidelines, and how she relates to her network at her community center and put in the daily work to make sure that underserved health communities get the support that they need. How she reasonably criticizes and wants nothing to do with some hotshot politicians. So that's a very big aspect of her complexity as a character. You see this in Sanem as well, sharing about his experiences in warfare. So by conclusion, at the end of the day, cyberpunk isn't about the neon or the mohawks. It's about fighting entrenched hegemonic power from the fringes of a dense city by hacking into the hypermodern technological mainframe and making it your own. This is the punk of it all. This is Solace State, which has constructed a play on cyberpunk as hopeful queer activism. Thank you. So this is us, and Solace State is available now on Steam and Xbox. Thank you. You can find us on these platforms.
There's a question that Tanya asks early on that really stuck with me. Why blend in when we can change the world for the better and for more people to be able to be authentically themselves? Regardless of the ways that corporations and political corruption and all sorts of other things are fighting to consolidate power in the hands of a wealthy few, I do believe that we each have our own tools that we can use to spread messages of love and to build better spaces for all of us in the future. I think these games and this show are a perfect example of just that. Thank you for your talk, Tanya and Seamus.